Okay, so would you mind stating for me your name and how long you've been living in where you live?
Okay, I'm Phil Shively, and Barbara and I have lived in this house for 47 years.
Okay. So what do you remember from when you first moved here?
Oh, when we first moved here, it was a very nice. It had a small town feel. It was we're in a big city, obviously, but this particular area is hilly. Um, it's bounded by fields from the agricultural college and by the highways and railroads. So it was like a little town of about 5,000 people with a little shopping area in the middle. And it's we had moved here from Hanover, New Hampshire, and we were appalled when we started looking around the city at how flat everything was. And we found this little area that sort of reminded us of a New England town. So that's what I remember thinking about it.
Okay. So what was were there any, like, I know you and Grandma both love gardening and observing the birds around your house. What were some of your favorite parts about moving here?
Well, moving here, well, one thing I remember when we moved into our house, a barred owl used to fly by our window at 6 o'clock every morning. I don't know why that particular one at that time, but it was fun. But our house and the neighborhood were sort of fairly standard suburban, lots of lawn, not too much else around the houses, but there were lots of big trees, which we liked a lot.
Mm-hmm. What kind of trees and plants did you guys have when you first moved there?
Well, mostly it was just lawn and some old overgrown shrubs, sort of standard at that time, 1970s standard shrubs. I forget the names of them. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, it wasn't very well. It hadn't been very well taken care of. But we had two big oak trees, which were really nice. This area originally, back in the 19th century, was oak prairie. That's prairie with a lot of oaks growing on it, and it was sort of controlled by fire. And when they developed it, they kept a lot of the old oaks, and so you had a lot of these old oaks, which when I touch our oak out front, I could imagine that it was, back before the place was ever settled, because that oak had been there before then. And that was fun.
Oh, great. What kind of animals do you guys see a lot around your house or generally around St. Paul?
Oh, yeah, we see, I keep a list of the various mammals we've seen. We've seen about 16 different species of wild mammals in our yard. Raccoons are real common. Squirrels, gray squirrels and red squirrels, and chipmunks are very common. We used to see lots of foxes. Don't seem to see them much anymore. And bats. We used to enjoy seeing the bats flying around in the evening. And lots of birds. Lots of warblers in migration and nesting birds of various kinds. Often owls. One time we had a pair of great horned owls nesting 2 doors away.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest changes that you've noticed from when you first moved to St. Paul to now?
The area we're in was pretty well developed at that point. There haven't been a lot of buildings since, because all of the lots were pretty well built on. One thing we like is that we live right by the St. Paul campus, and so that's the agricultural school. So they have fields that they use for their training and research, and so it keeps a sort of a rural feel. But beyond us, the city's been expanding out and out and out through the suburbs. So we've noticed that a lot. But for right around us, the natural world, in a way, has stayed kind of the same. There have been a couple of interesting changes, but it's not like some places where you'd move and everything green got cut down because everything was being developed.
Yeah. So what What were some of the smaller changes that you noticed?
Well, a couple of interesting ones. One was from global warming. There's some species that are moving that we now have around that we didn't have around 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Opossums, a couple kinds of woodpeckers, flickers and red-bellied woodpeckers. There's a butterfly I like, the giant swallowtail, which I first saw about 5 years ago. And it's a more sort of a southern species. And so we're getting this used to be really the North Woods up here. And it's getting to be some of the southern things are coming up. Then another thing is that there are some species, some things that are dying out. We used to have chimney swifts and nighthawks in the sky all the time. Anytime you looked up in the summer, you'd see chimney swifts coursing around, and you never see them now. And I think it's because the insect population is down. They just don't have the insects to eat. But on the other hand, one thing that's really interesting is that, and I think this is probably true around the country, but we sure see it here, a number of species that were deep woods creatures when we moved here, that would never be anywhere near where people were living. They were wilderness birds. Have learned to live. They've adapted and learned to live in urban areas with trees, and so coyotes, for instance. I first saw my first coyote here about 10, 15 years ago, and now we get them through fairly regularly, which may be one reason we don't have so many foxes, because they are hard on foxes. And wild turkeys. And there's a hawk called the Cooper's hawk. When we came out here, I used to go up to a wildlife refuge about 20 miles north of town. It was very wild, all dirt roads. I could walk all Sunday morning and I'd never see another person. And one day, a Cooper hawk flew across the road in front of me, and I thought, this really is a wild place. And that was back in the early 70s. But now, the Cooper's hawks have nested within a block of us, and they've just learned to use this urban forest. And we have pileated woodpeckers regularly now, which used to be only back in the forests. We get bald eagles flying over regularly now. They nest in the cities, all through the cities where there's water. They don't nest right around us because we're a little away from the river. But so we're losing things, and we're gaining things. One thing that we have lost, we are losing gradually, is these big old oaks. From time to time, one will die or have to be cut down, and so gradually there's still a lot of big oaks in our neighborhood from before the development, but gradually they're disappearing and they're being replaced. A lot of people have gardens now instead of lawns, which is nice. But we had to cut down one of our two big oaks because another tree fell into it in a storm and ripped out half its crown. And after it was cut down, I counted its rings and found it 135 years old.
Wow. Which
meant that it had been planted it had first taken root in 1880, back when this was just prairie.
Wow.
And we still have one of those big oaks back in our backyard. So that's fun. Yeah. It's really interesting living here. And of course, Grandma and I love to garden, and so we have about half our yard now in gardens. And we've tried to garden for wildlife. So we use a lot of native plants, and we don't spray much or fertilize much. And we try to keep some woodsy areas, and we do see a lot of things around the yard.
Are there any things that you either miss from, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, or that you actually like about, living in the Twin Cities now?
Well, one thing that I like is that we don't have nearly as many mosquitoes as we had then. I think they've gotten to be good at mosquito control, which in one sense I don't like, because a lot of wildlife, probably this has something to do with the fact that the chimney swifts as many insects to eat. But it's nice to be able to walk out in the yard and not be slaughtered. But I've noticed that there aren't as many migrant birds coming through as there used to be. A lot of the birds that nest in the northern woods have diminished a lot. It used to be that, and it might still be, but I doubt it, that when I used to walk our dogs at night, especially in the fall, on a nice night with a northwest wind, if I'd stand out there, I could stand out there in our front yard. About every 5 seconds, I'd hear a bird chirp in the sky above me. And I just knew that there was a river of birds flying over me in the dark. Because I'd hear them, and they'd be coming from different parts of the sky, and there were different tones, sort of different species. And I could have just imagined over me. I knew if I could see that, I'd see this river of birds flying down from the north to the south, and it was wonderful. And I think the numbers are just diminished so much enough now that you'd still hear birds up there, but it wouldn't be the same sensation. So there are a lot. There are a lot of things I miss, but mostly, as you may realize, I'm a very optimistic guy and a very upbeat guy, and I just enjoy the things that are new and different for me.
Great. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Oh, Alice, you got me talking. That's